Well, we're doing a series of sermons on the book of Revelation. It's a little weird, because the book of Revelation is a little weird. Strangest book in the Bible. Some of the early church fathers weren't so sure about letting it be in the Bible. Martin Luther wanted to throw it out of the Bible, 1500. People have done all kinds of crazy things with it, but we're going through it because we're exploring its deep, beautiful, profound themes. And in the process of that, we are kind of undoing or turning away from some of the cheap, modern, cheesy theology that's been imposed on the book of Revelation. So we're not preaching through it verse by verse because that would take a long time and that would not be everyone's cup of tea. But as I have said before in the first couple weeks of this series, if you have heard modern preachers talk about the book of Revelation, you've almost certainly been fed a theology of it that has only existed in the last couple of hundred years. All this business of sort of taking the book of Revelation, attaching it to all these modern events, nobody did that for 1,800 years. And then this theology called dispensationalism was born, and everything in the Bible had to be a timeline, and so the book of Revelation became this timeline, and we began to try to fit the modern nations to all of its events and all that kind of stuff. So, but this morning, I want to pick up where we left off last week, which was in Revelation chapter 5, with the scene surrounding the Lamb on the throne. You remember, God is holding this scroll in his hands. That's really the key to the whole book of Revelation, is the scroll. That's how it opens. God is holding this scroll in his hands, and in the scroll are all of God's plans written for a flourishing humanity. And John is weeping in Revelation 5 because no one can be found who is worthy or powerful enough to open the scroll, to break the seals and open the scroll, to unfold the plan. That's really with the inference. No one can be found who is worthy or able to unfold the plan that's in the scroll, the plan to restore humanity. But then one of the divine elders says to John, "Look, behold the Lion of the tribe of Judah, who has prevailed and can open the scroll." But when John turns, he sees not a lion. He sees a little lamb who has been killed, but who is standing in the center of the throne. And when the Lamb takes the scroll, first all the beings in heaven, and then every creature in the earth and in the sea go wild with worship. That's what John describes. And they do so because the Lamb's solution to the problem of the world is so shockingly unexpected. Instead of demanding or forcefully coercing the world into changing its ways, the Lamb has allowed himself to be executed by the very creatures who need to change. He has sacrificed himself. And as he has sacrificed himself, in doing so, he has triumphed over evil. And as I said last week, if you read Revelation 5 the right way, you can almost feel the shock, the sort of no way, as John and all of heaven turns and beholds the Lamb for the first time. It's as if they turn and they see the Lamb, and it dawns on them. They see the genius of it, the genius of the power of love over all things. And they begin to cheer and yell and sing praises. And then the Lamb takes the scroll and he begins one by one to break the 7 seals off of it. And since the scroll represents God's good plans and desires for humanity, you might think, oh, this is going to be really good stuff. He's going to break the seals, and it's then the next part of what John writes is going to be all this really good stuff, what's inside the scroll. But I think in John's thinking, the seals don't just represent a bit of wax to keep the scroll up, which is what people did in ancient times. The seals represent those things which are keeping the contents of the scroll from being opened, preventing the good things in the scroll from being unfolded in the earth. And so when the Lamb breaks the seals, we discover that they are war and oppressive commerce and danger of all kinds for human beings, and hunger and poverty and people being persecuted for their faith and goodness, and earthquakes and natural disasters. So the Lamb begins to break the seals off, and as Eve described, it's just all this tragic mess for human beings in the earth. And the Lamb has come to conquer them all, to undo them all. And actually, in the language of the New Testament, we would say he has undone them all. When the elder signals John to turn and he says, "Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah," who turns out to be a lamb, he says, "Behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, who has prevailed." Or to put it in the words of Jesus, it is finished. Now, in between the breaking of the sixth seal and the seventh seal, all these tragic things, in between the sixth and the seventh seal, there's an interlude of sorts. This comes in Revelation chapter 7. And the purpose of the interlude is that John wants to show us something that stands in stark contrast to the humanity that is being destroyed by all the tragic things represented by the seals on the scroll. So John, he describes it this way for us. "After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, saying, 'Salvation belongs to our God and to the Lamb who sits on the throne.' And all the angels stood around the throne, and the elders and the four living creatures, and they fell on their faces before the throne, and they worshiped God, saying, 'Amen, blessing and glory and wisdom and thanksgiving and honor and power and might be to our God forever and ever.'" Now, in the verses just before I read these, so that's the interlude. 6 seals, all this tragic stuff, and then John says, "And then I turned and beheld a great multitude, dressed in white robes, with palm branches, waving them before the Lamb." You know, palm branches, you remember like when we talk about Sunday and how the people laid the palm branches in the road. That's what you did for a returning warrior king. Except that Jesus doesn't ride in on a war horse. He rides on the foal of a donkey. And the people lay the palm branches in the road. So here are these people, the white robes, the palm branches, laying down, saying, "Blessing and honor and power, thanksgiving, wisdom, glory to our God and to the Lamb." This is the interlude between the seals that John shows us. Now, in the verses just before that, John describes this multitude as 144,000 people. 12,000 from each of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, there's a couple things you have to remember when you read this kind of thing in the book of Revelation. First, for John in Revelation, Israel is spiritual Israel. It's the church. It's the followers of the Lamb. Same thing the Apostle Paul does at the end of Galatians when he talks about the true Israel of God, the followers of Jesus. And second, remember when I said that everything in the book of Revelation is symbolic, because that's the nature of Jewish apocalyptic literature. And that includes all the numbers. The book of Revelation has a lot of numbers in it. And the numbers are picked because they have some kind of symbolic meaning. So in the Hebrew language, which was likely the native tongue of this particular John who wrote Revelation, his Greek actually, Revelation was written in Greek. It's the sloppiest Greek in the New Testament. Because he was likely originally a speaker of Hebrew or Aramaic. But in Hebrew, 1,000 is one of the biggest numbers in Hebrew language. So he takes 1,000, he multiplies it by the 12 tribes of Israel, and then he multiplies it by 12 again. It's just John's way of saying, this is really a lot of people. This is a huge multitude. The number shows up again in 14. Whenever people try to literalize the numbers, and people do it all the time, modern preachers do it all the time, whenever people try to literalize the numbers in Revelation, it always ends up being problematic. Here's a little history to illustrate that. Many of you have probably heard of the religious group called Jehovah's Witnesses. So I've spent a lot of time in my life talking with lots of different people who were part of Jehovah's Witnesses. So when Jehovah's Witnesses started in the 1800s, they read this, and they said, there's only 144,000 people who can be saved. Ever. Period. Well, in the early 1900s, when the total number of Jehovah's Witnesses passed 144,000, they had a problem. And they're not the only group. Lots of groups done this. They kind of said, what are we going to do now? So they said, okay. They made an announcement. They said, this is the way it really works. We didn't understand it before. Now we've clarified. The way it works is there's only 144,000, the most faithful, who are going to get to go and live forever in heaven with God and Christ. Others can be saved, only Jehovah's Witnesses, of course, but others can be saved, but they have to live on a restored earth. They don't get to go to heaven. They're not part of the 144,000. They don't get to go to heaven, live with God and Christ. And so, that was sort of the adjustment that they made. And the whole thing is really just the result of not understanding the genre of symbolic literature, which, by the way, all the early church fathers understood. But unfortunately, like for Jehovah's Witnesses, even that solution doesn't really work, because you get to the end of the book, and it doesn't say God's going to spend eternity in heaven. It actually says that God is going to come down and dwell among his people. So I don't know how that's going to work. The 144,000 go to heaven, but God's not going to be home because he's going to be down here with everybody else. So, and I'm not trying to pick on you, but I'm just saying the real lesson here is that when you start reading things into the text, instead of just understanding it in its historical context, understanding its nature as Jewish apocalyptic symbolic literature, the problem is you keep having to read more and more things into the text to make your ideas work. And then pretty soon you're far from anything it ever said. If I still haven't convinced you, the very first verse I read, verse 9, John describes the 144,000 simply as a great multitude which no one could count. What John is showing us in this interlude is that in contrast to the mess that humanity is caught in, these seals, these tragic things, here he's showing us that we have a massive number of human beings, more than can be counted, from every nation and tribe and tongue. And they are with the Lamb and dressed in white robes, and they're waving palm branches before him, and they're saying, Lord, you are awesome. John is showing us the success of the Lamb, who has been victorious in his seemingly bizarre redemptive strategy of self-sacrifice, of sacrificing himself, and who now has this great multitude from all over the earth who have seen the light of day, fallen in love with God, and come home to him and decided to follow the Lamb. John is showing us that they have been saved, they've been rescued, and that ultimately they are being delivered from the tragic destruction that's going on throughout the world. Listen to his description, John's description of their salvation. I love this beginning. Then one of the elders said to John, who are these who are dressed in white robes, and where did they come from? And I said to him, Sir, you know. I like that. You know. Don't ask me. This is your show up here. You know. So the elder said to me, these are the ones who come out of the great tribulation, who have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. Therefore they are before the throne of God, and they serve him day and night in his temple, and he who sits on the throne will dwell among them. They shall neither hunger anymore, nor thirst anymore. The sun shall not strike them, nor any heat. For the Lamb who is in the midst of the throne will shepherd them. Listen to this. And lead them to fountains of waters. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Now I want you to notice the phrase there in verse 14. These are those who have come out of the great tribulation. If you've listened to modern preachers teach the book of Revelation, or you've read books like Left Behind or The Late Great Planet Earth, then you know that phrase. They talk a lot about the great tribulation. And they teach that after Jesus comes back and raptures the Christians, there's going to be this 7-year period of terrible, worse than ever violence and famine and war on the earth. Some preachers teach Jesus comes back right before the 7 years. Some preachers teach that Jesus comes back in the middle of the 7 years because everybody's trying to figure out the timeline. Even though the book of Revelation, if you really understand its historical context and the way it's laid out, turns out not to be terribly linear. So they teach this whole idea about this 7-year great tribulation. But this, I want to tell you something, this is the only place in the book of Revelation that phrase appears. And later when John talks about time, and half a time, which is where they get the concept of these 3.5-year periods, these 3.5-year periods, not connected to the phrase, the Great Tribulation. And again, it's the problem of not understanding symbolic numbers and symbolic language. So what does John mean with this phrase, the Great Tribulation? Well, you have to understand it in its context. And this description of the rescued multitude, right? The rescued multitude in white robes before the throne of God, waving palm branches, saying, Lord, you're glorious, you're awesome. This description of the rescued multitude is given to us against the backdrop of all the problems humanity is experiencing, represented by the seals, war, and oppressive commerce, and all kinds of danger and hunger, and people being persecuted for their faith, and natural disasters of all kinds. Now, you might hear that, and you might say, well, Pastor Fran, that sounds like all the kind of stuff that's always going on all over the world, right? War and oppressive commerce, and all kinds of danger and hunger, and people being persecuted for their faith, and natural disasters. Pastor Fran, that just sounds like the stuff that's going on all over the world all the time. Exactly. Too many people who are poor. Too many people, like where we work in Haiti, are kept poor and hungry by the greed and the lust for power of their leaders. Too much danger in the world. Too many problems and too many wars. Do you know how many wars are going on in the world right now? As we sit here on this October 31st, 2021, 57 armed conflicts. They're not in the backyard, so you don't hear about them, and most of them aren't in the U.S., and so you don't get a lot of news about them. 57. People say, oh, there's going to be big wars toward the end times. There's big wars now. The last century contained the biggest wars the world has ever seen. Do you know what John is describing with tragic messes represented by the seals? Life in a fallen world. That's what he's describing. Which means that life in a fallen world, life at the mercy of all these difficulties, and how they tempt human beings to use power over one another, even to kill one another in our quest for survival and gain, that is what John means by the phrase, the Great Tribulation. You want to understand the Great Tribulation? You're living in it, according to John, right now. The real question John is posing is whether you have become part of the great multitude who is singing to the Lamb. I'm not going to walk you through all the details, but when the seventh seal is opened, what it symbolizes is the whole corrupt system of the world coming crashing down. And as Christ is pictured bringing down the powers of the world and calling human beings to come and be rescued, John describes two witnesses who, in the midst of all this chaos, are walking through the earth during this time of tribulation, and they're speaking the truth. And they're killed by the beast, but after 3.5 days, they rise again and come back to life. And people are always wondering, well, who are these witnesses? And modern preachers will always tell you who the witnesses are. And there are all kinds of theories, the most common being that they are Moses and Elijah. Of course, modern preachers talk about this like these are two specific, literal people, and when the world hits the 7-year tribulation, these two specific guys are going to be walking all around the earth. I don't know how maybe they're going to tweet. I don't know how they're going to get to everybody, but they're going to be walking all around the earth, proclaiming the truth and warning everybody. Preachers love to talk about all these things. Now, I've read all the theories, and I'm sure what John is doing is he has in mind different pairs of witnesses that have been and existed over the history of the people of God, like Moses and Elijah, perhaps Joshua and Zerubbabel, and in his own day, Peter and Paul, the two most famous witnesses in the time that John lived in, who, by the way, prior to John's writing, had both been executed by the beast, by the Roman Empire. Peter and Paul were killed at the hands of the empire. And I think John is telling us that there will always be those who faithfully witness to the truth and the goodness of God, and if they are killed, as many have been, others will always rise up to take their place. I remember years ago when persecution of Christians was at a high point in Russia, I remember hearing a Russian pastor speak. And he told the story of how he was dialoguing with a current contemporary Russian political leader. And the leader said this: the problem with you Christians is that when we kill one of you, two of you rise up to take his place. John is saying to the beast, good luck trying to wipe out the people of God and their witness. Because there are always going to be two witnesses. And they're always going to rise from the dead. Now here's something really fascinating. Maybe a bit of a side road. But when John describes the death of the two witnesses, he notes in chapter 11, verse 8, quote, their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. It's a little confusing because John is clearly referring to Rome. I mean, we'll talk about Rome as the beast more next week, but John is clearly referring to the city of Rome, and he's using these references to places known for some sort of immorality and ungodliness, Sodom and Egypt. He says spiritually, we refer to this city as Sodom and Egypt. He's clearly talking about Rome, but Jesus was killed in Jerusalem, so how does that make sense? He says the was laid in the streets of the city that spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt. Clearly, he says, where also our Lord was crucified. You think, does John not know his history that Jesus was not crucified in Rome? That Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem? For John, the beast of Rome is just the apex of the power-hungry powers of the world. And it was, after all, those powers, the powers of Rome, that executed Jesus through the order of Pontius Pilate. For John, Rome, the beast, in Revelation, the empire, it's a metaphor for the way the powers of the world work. The powers of the world draw all of us into that web of thinking like they think, of thinking that coercive, forceful power is the only way you're going to get to that which you seek. Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem. But he would have been crucified in Berlin, or Moscow, or Beijing, or Johannesburg, or Nairobi, or Washington, D.C. That's an interesting thought. Or Chicago. They're all Rome. They all spin the same way. That's what I want you to see as we swim around in Revelation. John's not telling us what Russia is going to do in the 21st century, or which modern pope or president is the Antichrist, or how America figures into the end times. Very popular theme for modern preachers. The problem is the Bible's an old book. America's not in it. But we, does that tell you about American narcissism? Forgive me, but we just think like America. America's the center of the world. America has to be in the Bible, right? So they get to the Revelation, and they read about some war, and they go, so this is where America comes in. He's not trying to tell us all those things. He's telling us that the world is a mess, and human beings are a mess, the seven ills, and that fear and greed and the love of power have destroyed humanity, and that Jesus, in becoming the Lamb and submitting to those powers, submitting to that tragic mess of the world, submitting to us, and submitting all the way to death, has defeated the whole thing by the power of self-sacrificial, other-centered love, exposing that whole system for what it is and calling people out of that system into the light of truth and goodness. I love an analogy that the theologian Greg Boyd uses. He's a theologian pastor up in the Twin Cities. And he loves to compare the cross to a jiu-jitsu move. I don't know if you know anything about jiu-jitsu, but it's different from other martial arts because other martial arts depend primarily on offensive attack maneuvers. But jiu-jitsu is built on the idea that the best way and the most noble way to defeat your enemy is to absorb his blow and through very creative maneuvers turn your enemy's strength actually back against him so that he ends up, in a sense, defeating himself. And Greg Boyd says, that's the cross. That's the cross, is that all the human powers and demonic powers of the world and the universe come against Jesus in this apex moment at the cross, and in some crazy, wild, creative move, through love, he turns the power of evil back on itself and defeats it. So now this whole section of Revelation, it ends with John relating to us this kind of odd little episode. It comes right at the midpoint of the book. And then the voice which I heard from heaven spoke to me again and said, John, go and take the little book which is open in the hand of the angel who stands on the sea and on the earth. So I went to the angel and I said to him, give me the little book. And he said to me, take it and eat it. And it will make your stomach bitter, but it will be as sweet as honey in your mouth. And then I took the little book out of the angel's hand and I ate it, and it was sweet as honey in my mouth. But when I had eaten it, my stomach became bitter. This is really the reflection or the encapsulation of everything that has come in the book of Revelation up until this moment. The unforeseen strategy and glorious triumph of the Lamb over evil, sweet as honey in my mouth. The terrible situation of life in the earth, where human beings are continually trying to survive trials of all kinds, poverty, hunger, war, and our own propensity to dominate one another, all of that bitter in the stomach. And that's the reality. The world is a mess. Creation is beautiful. You know, you guys listen to enough of my sermons that you know I talk about trees and sunrises and, oceans and, creation is beautiful. But the world is a mess and life is hard. It's harder in some places than others and in different ways in different places. You and I are not literally starving this morning, wondering if our kids are going to go to bed hungry, or whether a gang or some corrupt group of police will raid our home and kill us tonight. We're not refugees trying to flee across a border with nothing but the clothes on our back. The world is filled with that kind of stuff. We face that, but we still face trials, financial troubles. If I said right now, anybody in here got any financial trouble? Some hands would go up. Illness, problems in relationships, worries about our children, and maybe worries about the future. And wherever you live and whatever particular kinds of trials you face, what the tragedy of the world tells you is that your only choices are to try to survive or to join the system, to buy into the grab the power, dog eat dog, dominate before you're dominated system that the world turns on. But the Lamb is the one who refuses to participate in that. He refuses to play the game. He refuses to thrive or find his life by means of the domination of another person or group of people. He refuses to pick up the weapons. Remember the conversation with Pilate? I always find that conversation fascinating. Pilate's kind of on the fence. He's not really sure he wants to execute Jesus. Kind of goes back out to Jesus. He's like, I don't know, But Pilate's a product of and a leader of the system, right? You get it done. Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. Pilate rode in the same week on a war horse. Pilate knows how you get it done. So he says to Jesus, so why don't your disciples fight? Right? I mean, he's going to kill you. Why don't your disciples have swords in their hands? Why don't they fight? Remember what Jesus said to Peter after Peter did that little deal with the high priest's servants here? He says, those who live by the sword are going to die by the sword. He says, why don't your disciples fight? Jesus says, if my kingdom were of this world, or like the kingdoms of this world, like the powers of this world, my disciples would fight. But that's not the kind of kingdom that my kingdom is. And so they don't. The Lamb is the one, and this is his invitation to us. The Lamb is the one who refuses to participate. He refuses to play the game. He refuses to pick up the weapons. I saw a lamb looking as if it had been slain, standing in the midst of the throne. Instead, Jesus offers us a new way, a way of love. He offers you a new way, a new kind of journey in your soul and in life that leads to hope and love and joy. Long before the book of Revelation was written, the Apostle Paul described that same journey there. And if you listen to it, you know what you can hear in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 in Paul's writing? You can hear the seven seals, the tragic mess. And you can hear and see the great multitude dressed in white, waving palm branches around the throne. Listen to it. But we have this treasure that has come from God in the ordinary clay pots that are us, so that the excellence of this power may be seen to be of God and not really just us. We are hard pressed on every side, yet not crushed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. We are persecuted, but not forsaken. Struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the dying of the Lord Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifest in our lives. It's as if we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may also shine forth in us. Therefore, we do not lose heart. Even though our outward man is perishing, our inward man is being renewed day by day. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. So we do not look at the things which are seen. We look at the things which are not seen. We do not look at the things which are fleeting. But instead we set our eyes on the things which are eternal.